Lord Byron's epic poem Don Juan is widely considered as a masterpiece. It always bothered me, though, that it doesn't have any proper ending. It breaks off very abruptly after the 16th canto. So, just like with my German E.T.A. Hoffmann project about the Tom Kater-Murr, I couldn't help searching for continuations of the poem. In 1919, one American Samuel Claggett Chew, teaching English literature in Pennsylvania, counted and read as much as 28 continuations of Lord Byron's Don Juan. His article, The Centenary of Don Juan, published 1919 in the American Journal of Philology, was very helpful for me to look for and to find those continuations that I did want to read. I planned to read each and every continuation that picked up Don Juan's story exactly where Lord Byron had left it, leaving me unsatisfied with a disappointedly abrupt ending. Of those picking up Don Juan's story with Canto 17, I was able to read 12. I would never have been able to do that were it not for two websites. First, books.google.de, the other one being hearthytrust.org. I would have preferred not to advertise Google, but those are the digital libraries I did use. Coming from a different background than British scholars, I would like to tell you a little about my personal experience with Byron's Don Juan first, and why I felt it owed me a proper ending. I never started reading Lord Byron because I wanted to in the first place. My motivation at first was that of a musicologist. I read the play Manfred in order to learn about the incidental music of Robert Schumann and the symphony of Tchaikovsky. I read Childe Harold to learn about Berlioz. I read The Corsair and the Two Foscaries to learn about Verdi's early opera adaptations. The first poem of Byron that I read and started to love for its own sake was the Giaour. I still remember my first reaction to it. To me it felt like a Karl May novel in verse. And that association was not a coincidental one. Karl May mentioned Lord Byron in his own Orient cycle and in his autobiography. And you can see for yourself it is obvious how the author's self-stylization as a hero of his own stories matches that of Lord Byron to the point of being based on it visually. He also uses the word Giaour a lot. I remember loving Byron's footnotes, which felt very much like Karl May to me. I love them telling not only about the customs of the Orient, but also about Byron's own adventures there, turning his poem, very much like May's novels, into an autobiographic piece in disguise. So when I finally started reading Don Juan, sometime after watching Johnny Depp as Don Juan de Marco, I had very much reason to believe that I would like it. Now imagine my surprise on finding out that actually I did not. I do not wish to omit the fact that I have not yet read the whole poem in the original English language. I read the German translation of one Otto Gildemeister, a German journalist, author and politician. His translations have a very good reputation. Also, Gildemeister's translation did not prevent me from enjoying the Giaour, the Corsair and many others he also translated. There's one observation I would like to share here. I told you already how much I enjoyed Byron's very own footnotes to the Giaour. There are many of them. I count almost 30, and the whole Giaour is hardly over 30 pages long. In Don Juan, Byron uses footnotes much more rarely. I believe that's because anything he would have for good reason put into a footnote of the Giaour, he now puts into the text, and even worse, makes verses and rhymes out of it, blowing the whole thing widely out of proportion. Obviously, I hated the digressions, and the satire seemed both hit and miss to me. Many German scholars, including the novelist Stefan Zweig, think that, among other things, Byron's constant picking on Castlereagh and Southey has aged very poorly. I share that notion. And I don't mean that either Castlereagh or Southey were above reproach, but ridiculing Castlereagh's suicide instead of all the terrible things he did in his life is about an as useful political statement as killing August von Kotzebue. It does not argue your point, or any point, and does nothing for your cause. Taking a piss is not political. It is just personal and has no political value by itself. Just compare it with the amazing political clairvoyance of Byron's friend Shelley, and all the sharp wit wasted on Robert Southey becoming court poet of the Regency turns vain, dull, and pathetic very quickly, in my honest opinion. I have never stopped being fascinated by Lord Byron's Don Juan, but I did not enjoy reading it, while I was not fascinated by Robert Southey's Thalabar, but I did enjoy reading it. The first time I tried to get through Byron's Juan, I stopped after Don Juan had become the lover of Tsarina Katerina, the Empress of Russia. I closed the book there and then, and did not open it for another 7 years, I think. Still, I felt fascinated enough to start all over, and this time I got to the very end. Now imagine my second disappointment when I found out that in fact there was no end, and again I was left with an unfinished story. Some part of me knows, or say assumes, that Byron's Don Juan may actually not be about its plot. The footnotes that I mentioned earlier, the very footnotes that I thought were blown up into the stanzas and out of proportion, may in fact be what the Byronic satire is all about. Byron's Don Juan might not be about its plot, perhaps not even about Juan, but about the very digressions that I hate. But before I might bring myself to like them, I have to get the plot out of my system first, and therefore I felt I needed some kind of conclusion. And once I do have that, I might find myself being able to read Don Juan for a third time, and finally I might be able to appreciate all the digressions, which until now have kept bothering me, but which might be after all the true purpose of this work, the tail that wiggles with its dog. I have to start with Byron's story first, then I'm going to summarize my selected 12 continuations, one after the other. From what I could get from my occasional reading of the original English version, it is my impression that Byron pronounced the name of his hero Juan. So I shall pronounce it Juan whenever talking about Byron's character, and whenever talking about the hero of traditional legend, I shall say Juan, which I believe to be the correct Spanish pronunciation. From what I can tell, Juan and Juan have very different personas. Juan is also very far from being a Byronic hero. As a side note, Don Juan as a Byronic hero does exist, but he has not been written by Byron, but I would say Nikolaus Lenau in 1844, and set into music by Richard Strauss. Byron's own Don Juan is less Byronic than his Guybrush Threepwood. He is a good swordsman, he hasn't much of a beard, and is hardly ever an active seducer. Byron turns traditional legend on its head. Juan isn't chasing women. Instead, he is the victim of women chasing him, protecting him, master him, or intriguing against him. The theme of female intrigue is present from the very first canto. Juan is the son of Don José and Donna Inés. Their marriage isn't a happy one. Even though Byron describes Donna Inés as intelligent, it is made very clear that he does mean educated rather than clever. Most importantly, Donna Inés has learned to play a part, and she plays the part of a betrayed and abandoned wife with such conviction that it doesn't really matter anymore if Don José had actually betrayed her. People believe it because she says so. And she almost manages to get him into the bedlam. After Don José has died, probably out of frustration, Donna Inés more or less removes any other man out of her son Juan's upbringing and has him raised and educated by Donna Julia. Donna Julia is the young wife of Alfonso, with whom Inés had shared a premarital intimate relationship. Julia, a woman in her early 20s, punished with a husband 30 years older than herself, falls in love with 16-year-old Don Juan. They end up in bed together, and it is strongly hinted that his mother Inés planned for this to happen to begin with, because she wanted herself to get closer to her own and former premarital lover Don Alfonso, and to do that she was searching for a way to get Donna Julia out of the picture for good. Don Alfonso surprises them And even though Julia at first succeeds playing innocent and hiding Juan under the sheets, Don Alfonso discovers his rival as he is trying to leave the house. There is a duel, Alfonso is wounded, and Juan escapes naked into the night. Donna Inés sends Juan off to Cadiz to stay until the scandal has quieted down. Don Juan's ship, however, called the Holy Trinity, sinks, and after 1 week without food or drink, the surviving party in the lifeboat, which Juan is part of, eat first his dog, then Pigilio, his tutor, before they finally get washed ashore on an island near Greece. There, Juan, being the sole survivor, is nursed back to health by Haidee, the beautiful daughter of Lambro, a Greek pirate who kind of resembles the corsair from Byron's other poem. At present, Lambro is believed to be dead. Haidee and Juan fall in love with each other. They are in Lambro's cave, loving each other, and the way Lord Byron describes their love, like it was some kind of religious service, not in celebration of God, but in celebration of their love, strongly reminded me on Gottfried von Strassburg and his Tristan. I'm talking about the medieval Tristan here, not the Wagnerian one. Byron has probably read neither, still I can't ignore the similarity. By the way, Czech composer Zdeněk Fiebig wrote a whole opera only about the Haidee canto of Don Juan. I wish I could listen to it, but it has not been recorded yet. Instead of being surprised by King March, the young lovers are surprised by Haidee's father Lambro, coming back from a successful raid, sword in his hand, intending to kill his daughter's lover. Again, Juan tries to defend himself, but Lambro has brought a pistol to their sword fight. The enamored Haidee saves Juan by shielding him with her own body, but Juan is captured by Lambro's men and sold in chains as a slave. Haidee dies soon after that, of broken heart. On the slave market of Constantinople, Don Juan is acquired by Gulbeyaz, the frustrated wife of the rich and powerful Sultan. Gulbeyaz wants Juan as her lover. But to shield him from her husband's watchful eyes, she orders Juan to be clad with women's clothes and has him put into the serai. Since everyone believes him to be a woman and or pretends to do so, Juan is put to bed with Dudu, one of the Sultan's concubines. That same night, Dudu has an erotic dream, which leaves both very much or very little to the reader's fantasy. I believe it is this part of the story which has inspired an important sequence of Johnny Depp's movie Don Juan de Marco from 1994. During the next day, a gender-inverted version of Mozart's abduction from the Serai is played out. Gulbeyaz demands Juan's love. Juan rejects her because he is still in love with Haidee. Gulbeyaz plots the death both of Juan and Dudu, and in the end, Don Juan escapes her palace with the help of John Johnson, another Christian slave sold recently to the Sultan's household, along with Juan. John and Juan seek refuge with the Russian general Suvarov. Juan and John... Has Sergio Leone ever read Don Juan? Juan and John help Suvarov conquering Izmail, now part of Ukraine, probably besieged by the Russian army again very soon. Having little to lose, Juan and John help General Suvarov conquering the palace and earn his favor in the process. Juan also saves a little Muslim girl called Laila from getting killed by Cossack soldiers. Juan is sent before the throne of Tsarina Katerina to tell her about Suvarov's victory. Laila, the Muslim girl, goes with him. Now, the Russian Empress Catherine herself takes an interest in Don Juan and makes him her lover. Juan is too flattered by the monarch's favor to reject her. Also, Catherine's favor makes him rich, if unhappy, and even his mother Inés expresses in writing her approval of the monarch's motherly tenderness. But Juan gets ill, whether Catherine's tenderness becomes too overwhelming or whether he has been poisoned by the envious people of the Russian court is not said explicitly. However, Catherine seeks to remove him from the court and sends him on a diplomatic mission to England. As soon as June arrives in London, he is ambushed by 2 muggers, shooting dead one of them. Surrounded by rumors of adventure and romance, the young foreign diplomat becomes unintentionally fashionable very soon, particularly among the educated women. A foster mother for Lila is found in Lady Pinchbeck in order to give her proper education in the true faith. As a result, June turns into an even more illegible bachelor. Lady Adeline Amandeville decides to play the matchmaker for Don Juan and to find a good catch for him, last but not least to shield him from the designs of her friend, the voluptuous Duchess of Fitzfalk. This luscious and flirtatious blonde has, while on the fox hunt, already displayed her interest in June. The virtuous Aurora Raby, however, 16 years young, a Catholic just like June, and also a woman he actually likes, is deleted very quickly from Lady Adeline's list, since she intends June's marriage not only to be a good catch, but also just as loveless as her own one. During the dinner at Norman Abbey, which is Lord Henry Amandeville's seat, Don Juan is by chance placed close to Miss Raby, and after several failures he finally succeeds to get her attention. Realizing the possibility of mutual attraction, Don Juan seeks fresh air to clear his head. And this is where he finds himself haunted by the apparition of a ghost, a mysterious, shadowy figure following him, looking like a monk with a black robe. In the morning, Lord Henry tells Don Juan about the Black Friar, a ghost who, according to legend, haunts the former monastery, which was once his home. Lord Henry thinks this legend is jolly good fun, and his wife Adeline performs the Ballad of the Black Friar, a scene like in Wagner's Flying Dutchman. No one realizes that Don Juan has been truly shocked by the apparition. Only Miss Aurora Raby notices his change, but can't help believing herself to have caused it. This is the only time that Lord Byron actually alludes to the traditional legend of Don Juan. The apparition of the Black Friar reminds of Don Juan's legendary stone guest, both being supernatural symbols of repentance and discipline. But Lord Byron resolves the mystery in a parodistical way. Next night, the figure of the Black Friar surprises the terrified Don Juan in his bedroom, takes off the black robe, and turns out to be in fact the luscious blonde Duchess of Fitzfalk. Lord Byron had written 6 more stanzas of what might have become the 17th canto of his epic. This fact, however, was not widely known in the 19th century. Therefore, the aforementioned ending of the 16th canto was the point where the continuations would have to take over the narrative. So, let's finally get into it. The first continuation, which Google Books helped me track, bears the title Continuation of Don Juan, Cantos 17 and 18, published 1825 in London by one G. B. Whittaker and Munday and Slatter in Oxford. The advertisement references an anonymous Oxford student as the author. After wasting 35 stanzas telling about Lord Byron's poetic achievements and heroic death in Greece, and that he cannot join Byron in thinking Southey stupid or Wellington a tyrant, well, I couldn't either, so that's okay. But why keep talking about it? Just shut up about Southey, will you? Finally, the Oxford student gets on with the story. Now, seeing that what had seemed a ghost was clothed in most substantial flesh and blood, Don Juan wisely refuses both the offer of sex and to make a noise and possibly a scandal, because of his fears of being ridiculed, particularly in the eyes of Miss Aurora Raby. So he retreats and lets the Duchess walk away, which she does not like at all, and swears he shall regret it. The next morning finds Don Juan and the 3 women, Lady Adeline, the Duchess of Fitzfalk, and Miss Aurora Raby at the breakfast table. The Duchess chooses to ignore Don Juan's courtier's bow, and stays cold as ice, which is some kind of a letdown for me, since she had sworn revenge and now everything she does is, well, nothing. But she succeeds in keeping Don Juan uncomfortable. He can't eat a thing. After he has swallowed a cup of far too hot tea, Lady Adeline asks Miss Raby to hand him over the milk. That comforts him a little. Very soon he even needs more comfort, because he has received a letter from Spain. His mother has died. Don Juan is very sad and decides to go to Spain to visit her grave. However, his determination weakens considerably upon hearing a soft voice singing a song of love, which the aforementioned American scholar Samuel Chu calls quite mediocre. It is in fact Miss Aurora Raby singing, and she has fallen in love with Don Juan, but he doesn't know that. In the very night before his planned departure, Norman Abbey catches fire. Unfortunately, the Catholic girl Miss Raby has been forgotten and is trapped in the western tower. Don Juan heroically saves her, and that's it. That's the end. The description of the fire provides for an entertaining piece of action, but that's all there is to be found here. The story remains unfinished. I have tried to keep what I'd like to call a Norman Abbey score, based on the following 3 questions. Question number 1. Does Don Juan actually score with the Duchess of Fitzfalk? Question number 2. Does the relationship with Miss Aurora Raby evolve somehow? Or question number 3. Is there something going on with Lady Adeline Emmanuel? I'm going to try to keep score of that. So far, 1 score for Aurora Raby. The next piece is called Don Juan, Cantos 17 to 18, and has been published 1825 in New York by Charles Wiley. It does not advertise the authorship of Lord Byron directly and explicitly, yet claims to have been written by the same author as the preceding 16 cantos. Now, the anonymous author wastes a whole canto over 100 stanzas, not actually telling us what happens between Don Juan and the Duchess of Fitzfalk. At first, the names of Joseph and of Potiphar's wife are evoked, which seems to suggest that Juan is still trying to resist, just like the biblical Joseph did. Yet the name of Joseph slowly fades away, and in its stead the names of Caesar, Brutus, and Cassius appear, suggesting a betrayal of some sort. That might be the author's way of telling us that the Duchess has in the end succeeded in seducing him. The 18th and final canto tells us about the arrival of her husband, the old and ugly Duke of Fitzfalk. His reasonable suspicions against his wife and Don Juan worry his host, Lord Henry Emmanuel, who would prefer to shield Norman Abbey from the imminent scandal. He reminds the Duke of Fitzfalk that there is no positive proof yet. But the word is already out, and Juan's favour with Lady Adeline and Miss Raby starts to fade. A young and beautiful handmaiden, described as half Jewish and half French, who is herself in love with Don Juan, accuses him and the Duchess of adultery. She does so in Don Juan's and Lord Henry's presence, and at first in the Duke's absence. Yet, just as she herself had secretly hoped and planned for, the Duke of Fitzfalk arrives just in time to finally hear her confirm his suspicions. The end. That was an exhausting piece of literature. I hated it. Lord Byron would at least sometimes interrupt his endless ramblings with telling us something new and interesting about his characters. The author claiming to be him does it so rarely, and it's so vague, unclear, and, if I may suggest so, anti-Semitic terms. It becomes outright unbearable. So far, 1 score for Fitzfalk, still 1 for Rora Raby, still 0 for Lady Mandeville. The third piece is called The 17th Canto of Don Juan, in continuation of the unfinished poem by Lord Byron. It has been published in 1829 in London by W. Wilson. It states to be intended as the first canto of the remaining 8, and it is surprisingly long. Obviously, there was not enough demand for the remaining 7. It belongs to the more entertaining ones. The anonymous author does not bother giving us any explanation as of how Don Juan might have gotten rid of the voluptuous Duchess. Instead, he lets Sir Henry call Don Juan into his study. The Empress Catherine has died, and Sir Henry would like to trust Don Juan with a new and delicate diplomatic mission abroad, probably because he just wants the Spaniard out of his house, suspecting something might be going on between him and his wife Adeline. Still, Lord Henry grants Don Juan's request of letting him think it over for a short period of time, even though he himself would prefer his Spanish rival far, far away as quickly as possible. Instead, Don Juan goes back to his room and finds the Duchess of Fitzfalk in tears. We learn now that they had spent the night together, but that Don Juan would now prefer their affair to be over and done with. Recognizing no love in Don Juan's eyes, she faints. After having woken up again, realizing Don Juan had just left her as she was, she follows him secretly to plot revenge. Pondering his situation, Don Juan recalls the good advice Lady Adeline had once given him, and blames himself for having repaid her poorly. Still in thought, Don Juan enters a certain part of Sir Henry's estate, a pond and an island filled with antique statues of Cupids and Venuses. Lady Adeline has looked after those, and likes to serve tea surrounded by them. She does not actually waste any thought on what they mean and what they represent, the passion yet unknown to herself. Don Juan thinks about his Muslim ward, Lila. Lila is now under the tutelage of Lady Pinchbeck, which the author uses to seek into telling us about Lila. The very pious Lady Pinchbeck wants to teach her proper Christian values, making her pray 50 times a day, and forswear all temptations of the flesh. And indeed, she succeeds in turning the ward against her adopted father, Don Juan, because Lila now believes him to be on the road of the devil, and that it is her responsibility to save him. Don Juan understands neither her worries nor her tears. Asking Lady Pinchbeck about it, the lady evades a clear answer, blaming the religion of Leila's parents, which she had taught her to forswear. The author now digresses about the hypocritical sort of morality practiced by those whose first commandment is, "Thou shalt not know on earth felicity." End of quote. I like the fact that the author, an Irishman, actually uses Lila's character for something interesting. The potential of her character was never really exhausted by Byron himself, and the harsh critique of hypocritical Protestant education and morality seems to correspond well with Byron's own. But it is of little consequence for the story which now unfolds. Don Juan has now reached the island, as we recall Lady Mandeville's favourite place, and being a man of little remorse, Don Juan starts to calm down about the Duchess's oath of revenge. Don Juan now meets Lady Adeline, who seems to have fallen asleep while reading, and probably is dreaming some passionate dream, believing themselves to be alone. Don Juan makes the move on her and wanton passion starts to unfold. But Sir Henry is watching with a pistol, shoots, and hits his wife, who had been shielding her lover's body with her own. The scene is very reminiscent both of Julia and Don Alfonso, and of Lila and Lambro. Sir Henry challenges his surviving rival to a duel with a pistol, and, well, thus fell his lordship of Amundeville beside his lady, both in earliest bloom. The end. I have already approved of the Irish author's digression about hypocrisy and morality, which seemed to correspond to Byron's, but the love affair between Don Juan and Lady Adeline comes out of nowhere for me. Her secret passion has been foreshadowed by Byron before, but there is an elephant in this room, and that elephant is Miss Aurora Raby, whom the author conveniently ignores. Now, Lord Byron has ignored Lila for several cantos and the majority of stanzas, but Miss Aurora Raby has been at the very center of Don Juan's attention just one canto before, which is why I find the sudden wandering of his passion towards Lady Adeline not entirely convincing. This also happens to be my final verdict of 1829's 17th canto of Don Juan. Not entirely convincing. Updating the Norman Abbey score, Fitzfalk still 1, Aurora Raby still 1, Lady Amundeville 1. 4. The next piece is Canto 17 of Don Juan by one who desires to be a very great unknown, published 1832 in London by James Gilbert. The Great Unknown concludes the unmasking of the Duchess of Fitzfalk, with Don Juan rejecting her, but not because of his chastity. Actually, the Great Unknown considers the days of biblical Joseph's chastity long over and gone. Rather, he blames it on Don Juan still being frightened of the ghost, or having an image of Aurora Raby crossing his mind. Unfortunately, the commotion has already woken up the house, but the Duchess has a good explanation ready. She had been frightened by the ghost, the Black Friar, which then evaporated in the air. Don Juan had just come to save her, and didn't even stay to get his small clothes on the way. Unfortunately, Miss Aurora Raby learns about the event very soon. Particularly, Lady Adeline warns and tells Miss Raby that she had seen the Duchess coming out of Don Juan's room. Miss Raby defends Don Juan because, as a member of the Holy Catholic Church, whom no saint nor virgin would leave in the lurch, might have actually resisted the Duchess. But Lady Adeline takes care to confirm her worst, albeit wrong, suspicions. Don Juan, however, has already decided to pull all his eggs into one basket and asks Miss Aurora's hand in marriage. She keeps resisting, and he keeps pleading for another 42 stanzas to hold in suspense. The Duchess of Fitzfalk decides to return to her husband while making it obvious that she is not too pleased with Don Juan's performance. Noticing her revengeful eye finally convinces Miss Aurora Raby that Don Juan actually has resisted the wanton folly of the Duchess. So they talk again, they kiss. The end. I love it because digressions are kept to the minimum. Apart from that, we have a word for this kind of literature. It might be German or it might be Yiddish, I don't know. It's kitsch. And that's my final verdict. Kitsch. Keeping the score. Fitzfalk, still 1. Aurora Raby, 2. Lady Amundeville, 1. 1839's pastiche, Don Juan Jr., did not make it on my list because its story is mostly about his son and not about Don Juan himself. Lord Byron's Don Juan appears as a character, and he keeps wanting to confess about his former loves, but he's always interrupted whenever he's trying to tell something. So it's actually not about Don Juan, it's about the author trolling us wanting to know something about Don Juan. Next piece is Don Juan Reclaimed, or his peregrination, what does it even mean? Or his peregrination continued from Lord Byron. It has been published 1840 in Sheffield by the writer himself. His initials are W.C., which the British Museum believes to stand for William Cowley. I might also call this one Don Juan Reformed, because this is basically what happens. Don Juan reforms and becomes an essential, pious and chaste member of the English aristocratic society. It goes like this. Once the Duchess of Fitzfalk has unmasked herself, and Don Juan tries to embrace her, she flees in terror into her room and locks the door, leaving the astonished Don Juan cursing in the hallway. Next morning dawns on such a beautiful and magnificent English landscape. It inspires Don Juan to become a new man. He has recurring dreams of Lady Adeline, but whenever he approaches her, the spirit of the Black Friar, the true Black Friar, now again a symbol of repentance and discipline, holds him back, and Lady Adeline sings a song of chaste love. Don Juan becomes pious and praises the Lord and has productive conversations with Lord Henry. They have breakfast, they have a walk, they have dinner. It would be hilarious if it was a parody. Unfortunately, it is completely serious. Keeping the score, no one scores here. No one. So, Fitzfalk still 1, Aurora Raby still 2, Lady Emmanuel still 1. That's it, I think. Chronologically, the next 2 pieces are 1946's The Rest of Don Juan by Henry Morford, and the undated A Sequel to Don Juan, which has been attributed to George Reynolds. Those 2 are not only the longest, but also my personal favorite ones. Therefore, I prefer to set them aside for now and keep them for last. Instead, I'd like to continue with Don Juan Canto 17. This appeared in a volume of poems by Edward Wilberforce and Edmund Blanchard, published 1857 in London by Longman. So this is Don Juan Canto 17 by Edward Wilberforce. It claims to being written by Lord Byron himself, just that Byron is dead writing it, and he has joined the oasis of poets lying in the Elysian fields. Many other famous poets from ancient times are already there, joined by and conversing with Baroque, classical and romantic poets. Robert Southey is mentioned too, but for obvious reasons has preferred to occupy a different part of heaven. Some contemporaries like Thackeray and Dickens are also there, people which the historical Lord Byron would not have had the chance to meet. Anyway, all of them have now to suffer the judgment of their ancient colleagues. The canto is mostly about who is getting along with whom and who is not. It is one large insider joke that I have not the stomach to explain, but a funny one. There are no women in Elysium to occupy Lord Byron's interest, so Byron's narration can easily transition to Juan and to what he plans to do next with his character. Since Milton has disapproved of Byron's immorality, Byron has in the end reached the decision to reform his hero. First, he wants to push him right into the French Revolution and let his heavenly muse sing the song of the guillotine. This song, however, remained for Henry Morford and George Reynolds to sing, since Edward Wilberforce's canto ends right here. No changes in the score. Fitzfalk still 1, Miss Aurora Raby still 2, Lady Emmanuel still 1. The Shade of Byron, a mock-heroic poem containing strange revelations not hitherto disclosed, published 1871 in London by James Burns. A very lengthy foreword tries to cash in on the so-called Byron Stowe scandal. Harriet Beecher Stowe, most famous for writing Uncle Tom's Cabin, which, according to some, started the Civil War, had tried to defend Lady Byron, who had, in her opinion, been wrongfully accused and derided both by Byron himself and by his critics. She also disclosed information about Byron's relationship with his sister Augusta, albeit without calling her by name. The anonymous author now takes the opposite stand, defending Byron. To me, it feels like a sensationalist, misogynist money grab, and I had not the stomach to go into the details. The poem itself is written in an actually spirited and witty style. A lot is made of the probability that the Duchess of Fitzfalk may have entered Don Juan's bedroom in disguise for naught but honorable reasons. Plot-wise, it also contains some new and interesting ideas. Don Juan and the Duchess spend the night together, but they are observed by another ghost lurking in the shade. And unfortunately, Don Juan has forgotten to bolt the door. Waking up, the Duchess, having spotted this other ghost, is frightened and terrified because of it, even more so as the door is still open and they realize not only has the ghost gone away, but that he also took the Duchess' disguise with him. Instead, Don Juan decides to put his own clothes on her and disguise her as a man. Together they march out into the misty morning. Luckily, the Scottish valet McIver does not destroy their cover, but he has more distressing news. He too has seen the ghost. The Black Friar got away, but not before McIver had shot a bullet into him. Don Juan manages to get the Duchess into her room. Next morning, Lady Adeline calls innocent Aurora Raby to attend her and asks her to excuse her from her guests because she is ill. Actually, but Miss Aurora is too innocent to realize, she is not ill. The family physician, Sir Therapeute, no comment. The family physician, Sir Therapeute, very soon realizes that her ladyship has a gunshot wound. She offers him a precious piece of jewelry if he keeps quiet about it. The Duchess' handmaiden Honora, however, herself very fond of Don Juan, has a talk with Prudence, the handmaiden of Lady Adeline, and as soon as the monk disguise is found with stains of blood, the Duchess of Fitzfalk is able to count 1 and 1 together. The same morning, Don Juan's mettlesome charger, called Black Ranger, I believe that's a horse. Don Juan's horse disturbs the balance of Lord Augustus Fitzplantagenet as he passes him by, and causes him to lose a bet he had going with Sir John Silvercup. Lord Augustus had already lost a considerable sum, so he doesn't take it lightly, strikes Don Juan's horse across the nose, and gets his own cheek hurt in the process. Lord Augustus throws the next stone, causing Don Juan to use his whip, and in the end, Sir John and Don Juan have to care for the badly injured Lord Fitzplantagenet. But Don Juan is injured too, and his right arm becomes numb, as Miss Aurora anxiously observes. The highly amused Sir John turns their accident into the talk of the day, despite Don Juan insisting it had happened out of instinct, not malice. Don Juan very finds a precious pearl necklace on the carpet of his room, and hands it over to the Duchess, believing it belongs to her. But the Duchess at once recognizes the necklace to be her friend Lady Adeline's, confirming that the shady figure she spotted in Don Juan's bedroom and wounded by McIver's gunshot must have been hers too. And she puts the necklace to good use, blackmailing Lady Adeline to ensure both their nightly visits are kept a secret. Now that both Lady Adeline and the Duchess Fitzfalk are assured their respective secret is kept, Lady Adeline relieves Miss Aurora from her care to make room for Don Juan to attend her. A new visitant in black enters the scene. It is Reverend Blacksleeve. He's just one of several quite boring gentlemen in black who keep getting a lot of filler space that doesn't amount to much or anything. He just is the most pious and the most unnerving zealot among them. Very soon, the Duchess of Fitzfalk surprises Lady Adeline and Don Juan kissing. The Duchess does not like it. Juan leaves as courteously as always. Lady Adeline explains, "I sent for him just now. 'Twas necessary." "I know," the Duchess answers, "but was it necessary you should kiss?" Lady Adeline faints. The Duchess believes her dead and cries. Aurora comes to join in. But as the doctor, Sir Therapute, has established she is still alive, the Duchess starts plotting revenge. But before she can aspire to take it, we have to join Lady Adeline's guests, who have assembled to listen to the works of Lord Byron, the great free-thinker, and the young bard Requiem, whom Lord Byron both had mentioned shortly during the 13th canto. I had completely forgotten about them. We now have to suffer through 132 boring stanzas of the bard's latest work about the devil and the spirit of truth. As it turns out, Bard Requiem's verses do not make him as successful with the ladies as Don Juan. Spending the night alone, he expresses his frustration by translating the third ode from Anacreon into plain English. It is a nice contrast, and I couldn't help liking it. This night, Don Juan is visited by another female visitor, the Fairy Night Visitor, as Don Juan later calls her. We are left to wonder who she is, as they are interrupted early in the morning by the valet of Lord Augustus Fitzplantagenet. Do I pronounce it right? Plantagenet? Platin? I'm sticking with Plantagenet. The Lord demands satisfaction for the wound Don Juan gave him yesterday and challenges him to a duel. The duel, however, takes several rounds to complete and is kind of funny to read. The first round is with pistols. Lord Fitzplantagenet deliberately stands sideways to be less exposed. I'm getting vibes of Carmy's Winnetou here, part 1. He misses Don Juan, but Don Juan shoots his nose off. At second try, the Lord cheats by shooting earlier. Now even the Lord's friends are crying, "Shame, shame," albeit without bell ringing, but they forbid him to use the pistol again. Don Juan gallantly shoots into the air. Now, the Lord calls for swords, but proves unable to score a hit, until the Don just disables his sword arm, which ends the fight in Don Juan's favor. He is astonished his youthful second, meanwhile, has disappeared, and no one knows where. We are later told his second was actually another woman in disguise. Coming back, Don Juan finds a small casket in his room, which turns out to be a music box, the present of a woman. The rhymed billet tells of a woman's love, and threats to die if her love is not returned. Don Juan has no idea who sent it, nor who was the Fairy Night Visitor, now gone, nor who was his disappearing second. Don Juan joins breakfast. The women of the present aristocracy talk about fashion and dancing, while the earnest male thinkers, the gentlemen in black, indulge in boring philosophical and metaphysical questions. Dick Dubious is a strong believer in metaphysics and argues with Lord Byron about human afterlife. While Lord Byron denies the value of any religious creed on that matter, Dick Dubious insists afterlife exists. And Reverend Blacksleeve insists that creation is sinful by its very nature and in need of salvation, that only the Holy Scripture can provide. Reverend Rodderman Precision would deny that nature, truth, or reason could not provide some comfort in the hour of death. And it goes on like this. It might actually be an interesting matter, and it does not fail to connect via numerous footnotes with some opinions that Lord Byron formerly had expressed, but it has nothing to do with Don Juan or the women chasing him, and all it actually tells us about them is that life and conversation of English aristocracy are so boring that they are in dire need of a ghost or a Don Juan to spice it up a little. But as the poet says, our hero vanished long before. I wish I had too. Having left the theologic disputants squabbling, Don Juan meets his second again and asks him why and where to he had vanished. The young man denies to have ever seen him and cannot provide any answer as to why Don Juan would think otherwise. Yet they exchange cards and talk. Meanwhile, at Norman Abbey there is news that Lord Fitzplantagenet has committed suicide and left a whimsical goodbye note, which Requiem afterwards sets in verses. It is funny, just not funny enough to quote. Lord Henry is still wondering who shot his wife Adeline. The story she gives is such that she met the horrible Blackfriars ghost, that she followed him, and once she had reached him, he had turned around and shot. Lord Henry suspects foul play. In the penultimate canto, the anonymous author announces his plan to let Don Juan finally leave Norman Abbey, but now in the last canto it seems he just has no idea how to do it, so it's actually filler. It's just the author invoking alternately the spirit of Lord Byron and his muse, that's all there is. I would call this version the most detailed and the best of those trying to conclude the adventures of Norman Abbey. There are some nice little quirks. Don Juan, for the first time, gets to speak his English with a Spanish accent. He keeps saying D for th and S for sh, and mixing French sentences in between. That's nice. The mishappened duel corresponds very well with the way Lord Byron was subverting any expectations we might have for a Don Juan story. Remembering the legend or the opera, we would expect a Don Juan to chase women and duel men to the death. Instead, women chase him, and the only duel happening is in fact one where Don Juan is challenged basically over nothing. He even puts a great effort in not killing his challenger. Instead, the challenger kills himself. Unfortunately, for every 2 stanzas of plot, we get 8 stanzas of filler. Lord Pirrot's and Reverend Blacksleeve's endless discussions of piety versus nature, that's filler. Bard Requiem's collected poetry, that's filler. Endless evokings of Lord Byron and his muse, that's filler. Endless appendices, that's filler too. There is also one interesting original character introduced, Honora, the handmaiden of the Duchess of Fitzfalk. Her origins and upbringing is described in such length, I get the idea that she was supposed to play a more substantial part in the cantos yet to follow. It is said that she had a brother. My guess is that the young man Don Juan meets and mistakes for his disappeared second of his duel is actually Honora's brother, and that Honora has disguised herself as Don Juan's second. But that's just my guess. No one will ever know, because no one cared to know in the first place, and I can't blame anyone for that. It's just not interesting enough for so much exhausting filler to suffer through. Now, both Fitzfalk and Lady Amundeville score in this piece. The present score is Fitzfalk 2, Aurora Raby 2, Lady Amundeville 2. Next piece. Don Juan, Canto 17, published 1870 in London by Thomas Cooper. This is a curious piece. Quite many of the stanzas have been replaced with asterisks, leaving us wondering what, if anything, is happening in those stanzas that either the author or his publisher prefers us not to read. What happens between Don Juan and the Duchess of Fitzfalk is left equally vague. Their last embrace in the morning is described as a fond one. However, their demeanour at breakfast is so cold it leaves all the others wondering what has happened. Lord Henry even asks if he has been visited by the Black Friar again, a question which Juan finds distressing to answer. Lady Adeline blames Miss Aurora Raby for Don Juan's melancholy, while Lord Fitzplantagenet, who also has his eyes set on the Duchess of Fitzfalk, rejoices in the prospect that Don Juan might just have lost his favour with her. The innocent Aurora Raby does not even join the breakfast and sends her compliments instead, claiming she should go to town later to see her tutor. In fact, it is her innocence forbidding her to act a calm, observant part. It is her innocence driving her out of such unhallowed house. Juan starts looking rather sad on hearing the message, as Lady Adeline jealously observes. The day ends with none of the protagonists talking another word with each other, and Lady Adeline pondering if she should try the monk's robe herself for a change. Next morning the Duchess has already left the house and sent her rival Lady Adeline a fond goodbye letter. We, both of us, were foolish. Remember, both of us are in disgrace, if this small matter should at all break bulk. Your fond, affectionate, most dear Fitzfalk. It is in fact a lot more boring than I've probably made it sound. And I think no one scores here. As I read it, I don't think Fitzfalk scores in this one, so no changes on the score. Next piece. The New Don Juan. The introduction by Gerald, Noel Byron, and the last canto of the original Don Juan, from the papers of the Countess Guiccioli, published 1880 in London. You might think it would begin with Lord Byron's last original stanzas of the unfinished Canto 17. It does not. It is a complete forgery written by Gerald Noel Byron. Whether that was an adopted name, I was not able to find out. It begins with the demasking of the Duchess of Fitzfalk, claiming the friar's grey-robed ghost in peace was laid, to Juan's satisfaction be it said. And then another stanza is claimed to be missing, one of many in this forgery, but I count the word satisfaction as 1 point on the Fitzfalk score. The next stanzas deal with Lady Adeline being jealous of Miss Aurora Raby. In this text, however, the name of Lady Adeline has throughout been replaced with the name of Lady Caroline. Whether that's supposed to allude to Caroline Lamb, I cannot say. This Lady Caroline, aka Lady Adeline, now desperately tries to get and to keep Don Juan's attention, but he keeps dreaming about Miss Raby. While Lady Caroline's advances do not seem to bother her husband Henry, they do not escape the attention of the jealous Duchess of Fitzfalk. Feeling trapped between the jealousy of both and his true love for Miss Aurora, Don Juan gets very sick. Her ladyship, though very sadly, advises a change of air. Still indecisive whether he should go to Spain or return into the arms of the Russian Empress, Don Juan muses about his past loves. That same night he hears a sigh of passion coming from the door, and it's Aurora Raby. She has been sleepwalking right to Don Juan's bedroom. He gently wakes her up. She cries, but he is far from abusing the situation and lies her down very tenderly. They spend the night together, but in chastity. Luckily, Don Juan has remembered to bolt the door, because the Duchess tries to get in again, albeit in vain this time. The young couple does not even realize she was there. Don Juan gets better very soon, and it shows. Lady Adeline, aka Caroline, is very glad about it and enjoys spending time with him. Little does she know that the Duchess believes her to have occupied Don Juan's room when she had not been able to get in. Now the Duchess threatens to expose her. The rumours reach Sir Henry's ear, and he challenges Don Juan for a duel. They use pistols, and out of sympathy, Don Juan reels and takes the shot, bringing no comfort to Sir Henry, who now has to lament the loss not only of his honor, but also of a friend. They seem to follow the script of Pushkin's Eugen Onegin. Don Juan's life is saved by a skillful surgeon and Aurora attending him. while Lord Henry and Lady Adeline, aka Caroline, agree on a divorce out of court. I'm not sure that would have been possible back then. Aurora's tutor, the Lord Chancellor himself, approves of Don Juan's and Aurora's marriage, and they're off to Spain to live happily ever after. It's kitsch too, like most versions, that end up joining Aurora and Juan as a happily married couple. Still, there is some small amount of subversion to be found in the fact that the duel gets fought and the Amandelvilles' life ruined for the very only sin Don Juan actually did not commit. Keeping the score: Fitzfalk 3, Aurora Raby 3, Lady Amandeville 2. Don Juan, Canto 17, is found in the poetry book To the End of the Trail by Richard Hovey, and has been published 1908 in New York, 8 years after his death in 1900. Richard Hovey was an American poet. He taught English literature at Barnet College and wrote 4 lengthy plays about King Arthur and his knights. Not only did he write a lot of poetry himself, he also translated works of Paul Verlaine, Maurice Maeterlinck, and Stéphane Mallarmé. Recreating the metre of the original French in English may require a skill set similar to that of recreating Byron. If that's true, Hovey was a good candidate for finishing Byron's Don Juan. Samuel Chu praises his effort as one of the most convincing reproductions of Byron's verse. Plot-wise, I deem it wanting. We meet Don Juan standing upon the deck of a ship, passing by Fire Island, probably bound for New York. We never actually learn the where to or the why. He is accompanied by a rich and far-traveled salesman in knickerbockers, called Van Smythe. Don Juan enjoys very much the rich salesman's selection of wine, and has his eyes set on his beautiful red-headed wife. She is called Eleanor Van Smythe, and has 27 different kinds of Helena. Speaking of hell, this is where Lord Byron, the alleged author, is now. And he feels very lucky about it too, because it seems so much more interesting than heaven. Indeed, it is so interesting he decides to give a description instead of following Juan any further. He describes a lengthy conversation he has with 2 angels with surprisingly female shape, and how everyone around seems to have brought whatever used to be his hell on earth with him into this one, receiving the punishment that fits the crime. I quote, "Napoleon still leads armies to his ruin, and I continue still to write Don Juan." Byron confesses to have forgotten most of what the last cantos actually were about. Albeit there is still some memory of Lady Adeline and the Duchess, the name of Aurora Raby he can no longer even remember. In the end, he decides to let dead cantos bury their own dead, and instead to search through the New York Journal to find a new, updated class of villain. Even though I find myself far less enthusiastic about Hovey's canto than Samuel Chu, I love him for his last 2 stanzas. First, they form a bridge to Lord Byron's original first stanza, in which he was complaining about the abundance of short-lived heroes in modern journals. Now, in his last stanzas, reading a contemporary journal, he finally and explicitly acknowledges that Castlereagh and Southey may no longer be scoundrels still worth writing about. I can't help feeling happy for him to have finally gotten the hint, even if it is only posthumously. No changes in the score. Fitzfalk still 3, Aurora Raby still 3, Lady Amandeville still 2. Now, coming to my 2 favorites. First, a sequel to Don Juan, published in London by Paget and Company without year. It is anonymous and undated. However, the British Museum believes it was printed around 1843 and most likely been written by George William McArthur Reynolds. If that is true, it has been written by one interesting and colourful figure. George Reynolds was the writer and the editor of many successful penny dreadfuls, those serialized, mostly historical fiction novels would outsell Charles Dickens in their time. Dickens and Reynolds are claimed to have hated each other. Then again, Reynolds hated and was hated by everyone else because he was such an awful man. He had surprisingly modern and liberal political views, but anyone would eventually start to hate him. You might call him a successful plagiarist because he was very good in adapting successful concepts of other authors and make them his own. The concept of his most successful serial, The Mysteries of London, was borrowed by Eugene Sue's The Mysteries of Paris, and his historical fiction borrows heavily from Alexandre Dumas, Marquis de Sade, Victor Hugo, and Edward Bulwer-Lytton. There is little original in them. What is original and interesting about his historical fiction is its introduction of fantasy and horror elements, particularly in his medieval romance Faust, and its spin-off sequel, Wagner the Werewolf, one of the first novels with a werewolf theme. Writing good plagiarism and writing good pastiche are very closely related activities. His pastiche of Lord Byron is an actually entertaining one. Reynolds' Don Juan does not hesitate to take advantage of the situation of having a naked Duchess of Fitzfalk having entered his bedroom. Lady Adeline, however, had foreseen the predilection of her wanton grace, and hinted to Lord Henry how she grieved that the Duke of Fitzfalk never showed his face at their abode. Next morning finds the Duke's husband visiting his lordship in his study, when Lord Henry is requested by the Crown to return to London. That would give him the power to aid his young friend Juan's mission, and he goes at once with the Duke of Fitzfalk to seek Don Juan to both introduce them and tell him the good news. Instead, they find the two adulterers in flagranti. Lord Henry gives the Duke the very good advice to avoid ridicule by sweeping their discovery under the rugs, letting Don Juan take his leave that noon, and letting the Duke of Fitzfalk wear his horns with dignity, conveniently averting the impending scandal. It does not work. Miss Aurora Raby's affection for Don Juan dies that morning, and she disappears from his story, never to return. Thus, while the Duchess is still hoping for another rendezvous, only Lady Adeline is sad to see him leave. Thus, Don Juan returns to London and visits Lady Pinchbeck and their common ward Lila. Now, Reynolds introduces an original character, Lila's beautiful French governess, Rose Delacour, finding her modest and virtuous charm very different from the vain parade of English aristocracy he has just witnessed. Don Juan at once falls in love with her. He becomes a frequent visitor. Lady Pinchbeck soon realizes he is not coming to see his ward Lila. She decides to have a lengthy moral conversation, at the end of which Don Juan decides to ask Rose to become his lawful married wife. Meanwhile, Lady Adeline is unable to banish Don Juan from her thoughts, so she feigns an illness and retires to her room. However, she also tells her confidential and trusted maid, Miss Henrietta, about her true feelings. Despite having a weakness for Don Juan herself, the pretty Miss Henrietta helps her ladyship arrange in secrecy one last meeting with Don Juan. Now, the author isn't very clear about what happens during that meeting, but tears and vows and passion and a last fond embrace are definitely part of it. Unfortunately, coming out of her door, he runs right into her husband. Pushing the cuckold Henry Mandeville aside, Don Juan tries to reach for the next exit. Miss Henrietta hides him at her chamber and delays Sir Henry as he tries to get in. Having finally entered Miss Henrietta's room, he scolds his conspirating maid and fires her. And Don Juan would almost have succeeded hiding himself under her bed had he not accidentally pushed over the chamber pot, spilling everything it contains. There is a scuffle, and Don Juan escapes. But Lord Henry proves unable to follow the advice he had himself given to the Duke of Fitzfalk. He has his lawyers Rackham and Wrench file a divorce suit based on Lady Adeline's culpable conduct. Lady Pinchbeck cancels Don Juan's and Miss Delacour's engagement and forbids any further contact, setting Don Juan on a downward spiral. While the lawyers Rackham and Wrench demand £500 from him, he has already lost the very last of his money gambling and is unable to pay. Unsure if and when remittances from Spain or Russia will arrive, he is forced to take lodgings in an English boarding house, living door to door with prostitutes, gamblers, and impostors. When Don Juan has reached the bottom thus, his fate and Miss Rose Delacour's are joined by sheer luck. One of his restless walks, he just passes by her modest cottage in the neighborhood and spots her through the window. Soon they fall in love once again and plan to marry, but still they have to wait for his remittances. After months of relative chastity, one night in springtime they engage in premarital sex. The remittances arrive soon after, accompanied by a letter from his mother. Donna Inez has married once again and given birth to twins. She is pissed off since her new husband won't let her attend the bullfight because of completely unfounded suspicions he has, and she can't send money herself, at least not until her rich aunt has died. Fortunately, Don Juan is already well endowed again and goes to pay off the lawyers Rackham and Wrench. On his inquiry, they tell him that Lady Adeline, sadly, has died, alone and abandoned by everyone else. The sudden depression drives Don Juan into the gambling hall again, and within another hour he has again gambled away everything he had. Empress Catherine now personally asks for Don Juan's presence in Paris. Based on his considerable lack of funds, he decides to accept Catherine's request to delay his marriage to Miss Delacour for another month and to drive to Paris instead. He arrives at Paris in the days of revolution. He becomes a witness and participant of the events in the Tuileries at the 20th of June 1792. Reynolds describes how the sans-culottes, radicals from the Faubourg Saint-Antoine and Saint-Marceau, demand admittance to the king, with weapons in their hands. If you do not know, sans-culottes are the people with the red Smurf hats. As history tells us, King Louis was able to pacify the sans-culottes by wearing a Smurf hat himself. That calmed the radicals down for a month or two. Now, Reynolds tells us that there were also some royalists present who were convinced the insurgents intended to kill the king, which they might very well have. Don Juan, being a true royalist, assumes the lead of a squad to save King Louis and his wife Marie Antoinette. Even though he kills several rebels, he is finally wounded and subdued. A mysterious nurse at the hospital attends his wounds for 3 full months. In his delirium, he mistakes her for his beloved Rose Delacour, but we never learn her true name. Now, during the 3 months of Don Juan's slow recovery, the Tuileries and King Louis have fallen. The time of the revolutionary tribunals, the reign of terror, has begun. We are now introduced to the public minister and prosecutor Fouquier-Tinville, a short, fat, red-faced man with small but piercing eyes. We watch him in his office as he sentences by the dozen the enemies of the revolution to death. He is visited by a mysterious and beautiful young woman in white clothes, who begs him for a pardon for the now imprisoned Don Juan. Their dialogue, wherein she now pleads for his life, is easily the best and the most entertaining one of the whole piece, and probably all other continuations of Don Juan, in my honest opinion. Reynolds manages to describe Fouquier-Tinville as a villain not out of malice, but in fact out of a sense of duty. He is no Scarpia, And that makes it even harder to imagine how, if at all, our mystery woman might possibly persuade him to act against his conviction. If she won't give up her fantasy to save the Spaniard, he asks her to meet him again amidst the gardens of the Tuileries next day at noon, and we fear what other conditions he might yet prescribe. They meet at noon. He shows her the prison, the guillotines, and all the other devices to ensure the Republic's future. Then he invites her for dinner, and she has to watch him eat and pierce her with his small eyes for an hour that feels like eternity. Then he hands her over Don Juan's pardon, with no condition at all, but to bear witness there was one deed from all the rest apart, the only act he ever committed out of generosity. I found it a scene that lingered for a while. I found it surprisingly touching, actually. What made it linger for me was Taville's implicit realization that his legacy would indeed not be that of a hero of the Republic of France, and that his one good deed, in fact, also kind of condemned all his others. I did not foresee that, but to me it did not seem out of character. The fact that Reynolds made it work despite the contradictions, or because of them, made the canto for me. It is, unfortunately, also his last. We never learn who the woman in white, probably also the nurse, actually was. Rose de la Cour is the obvious one, since she knows French and still intends to marry June. But then, if she was also the nurse, why would she keep silent for over 3 months without revealing herself to June? It doesn't make sense to me. Aurora Raby and Donna Julia may know French, but they would have no more reason to go to France for June's sake than the Duchess of Fitzfalk has. Lila may have learned French and had a reason to save her tutor, but she doesn't match the description, which also contains blue eyes. Rose is all we have, and that she did not reveal herself to her betrothed, nor has been recognized by him over a period of 3 months, just doesn't make sense. It is probably just one of the very corners that Reynolds accidentally wrote himself into when he decided to jump from June 1792 right into the Reign of Terror, and had somehow to skip 3 months. As a result of that, he was not able to finish his poem in a convincing manner, and that's why he just didn't. That's a pity, because it contained so many different things of interest. Don Juan's being caught in flagranti twice, maybe variations of a scene we already read in Byron's original first canto, but Reynolds adds just enough details of his own to keep them interesting. He's not even shying away from toilet humor. There is piss, there is shit, there is life, actually, and the satirical depiction of an English boarding house and its low-life inhabitants offers a fascinating contrast to those of English high-class aristocracy. Lady Adeline's story turns from comedy right into tragedy, and the scenes from the French Revolution and the Reign of Terror are kept completely serious and suspenseful. Additionally, Reynolds' skill concerning the meter works wonders in elevating his dialogue, which in his usual prose I typically find god-awful, particularly when women are involved. As a side note, I think it speaks volumes that Reynolds' best female character, besides the mysterious woman in white, is actually deaf-mute and therefore not able to speak. I am, of course, talking about Nyssa from Wagner the Werewolf. The meter, however, works perfectly, turning otherwise probably awful female characters into tolerable and fascinating ones. I wish there was more, but for a proper ending I might have to finally consult Henry Morford. Keeping the score: Fitzfalk 4, Aurora Raby 3, Lady Emmanuel 3. Henry Morford's version is called The Rest of June Inscribed to the Shade of Byron by Henry Morford. It has been published 1846 in New York. Now, Henry Morford was a New York journalist and editor living in Brooklyn. He wrote numerous essays, travel guides, and poems, several Civil War novels and stage plays. When he wrote the rest of Don Juan, however, most of his output was still lying in the future, because Morford was just 23 years old when he finished Don Juan. Never ever was he a penny dreadful writer like Reynolds, and never did he reach such a big audience. But he did know how to write a good pastiche. 30 years after finishing Don Juan, he wrote a continuation and satisfying conclusion to Charles Dickens' last and unfinished novel, The Mystery of Edwin Drood. Of all his books, this was the most successful and most often reprinted one. The rest of Don Juan was never reprinted. Probably he thought of it more as of a youthful sin. Unfortunately, you have to get through 90 exhausting stanzas of Lord Byron's eulogy and then 30 more about the question if love in the moonlight is more sinful or more voluptuous than at daylight, until the plot finally starts moving. Speaking of night, Don Juan and the Duchess spent it together. And now it is morning, and the horns are already calling the yawning dawn to the next fox hunt. He rides with Sir Henry, Lord Fitzplantagenet, and Sir Harry Silvercup, because he is scared of staying alone and vulnerable to being sought out by the Duchess again. And he does not want that, because he still has the hots for the virtuous Miss Aurora Raby. Again, Don Juan and the ambitious Lord Fitzplantagenet compete for getting the fox first, and end up riding both their horses right into a wall. While Don Juan still manages to jump over it and breaks his arm during the following fall, Lord Fitzplantagenet hits the wall with full force and breaks his neck in the process. I like the duel better. A woman is heard screaming as Don Juan falls, but we never learn if it was the Duchess, Aurora Raby, or Lady Adeline. The suspect remains on Lady Adeline, though. Don Juan is carried into his room and cared for by the surgeon, then left to sleep. Lady Adeline watches over him and his feverish dreams, hearing him cry for Haidee, realizing it must be the name of his former love. It is repeated that the relationship between Lord and Lady Amundeville is by no means void of respect, just void of love. So her interest in Don Juan demands her to stay and keep listening into his dreams, until one day he finally talks about the Duchess of Fitzfalk too. Lady Adeline understands at once what has happened between the two, but she is far too cunning to create a scene. Instead, she treats the Duchess with exactly the right amount of passive aggressiveness to make her understand that her rendezvous with Juan has been uncovered. Still, the Duchess is far from admitting defeat. She has a new plan and leaves Norman Abbey for London to set it in motion. Having recovered in the following September, Don Juan visits his ward Lila at Lady Pinchbeck. Much distressed, Lady Pinchbeck shows him an article published in yesterday's issue of the Herald, telling everything about a certain Lord A.M.D.V., made a cuckold by his beauteous wife, Lady A, and her lover, a certain young Don from Spain. Don Juan understands very well that the article had been planted by the Duchess in order to keep him away from Norman Abbey and both Miss Raby and Lady Adeline. He decides to confront the Duchess about it at once, but the Duchess of Fitzfalk is far better at hypocrisy than he could ever aspire to be, and the only thing that he is able to extract is her frosty smile. Not willing to grant her the triumph, he feigns a smile too, yet has to admit to himself that England has little left in it to keep a Don Juan, and decides to return either to Russia or to Spain. Still, he tries to set things straight with Lord Henry. Lord Henry receives him, but they are not able to talk a word with each other. In the end, Don Juan takes a pen and writes on a piece of paper, truthfully, that the article printed by the Herald has been a lie, and that not a word of love has ever passed from the first moment's meeting to the last between Lady Adeline, his wife, and him, his guest. The tension is thick, and they never exchange another word. But the possibility of a conciliation between husband and wife is indicated, which is kind of boring. But after reading about so many deadly duels and scenes of rage and passion, I found it both refreshing and kind of true to life. Even in Lord Byron's original depiction, the Amundevils like to see themselves as realists and rationalists. While the presence of Don Juan might have caused some commotion into the boring stability of their life, it might as well just die down in its absence. The witchery of Don Juan's winning art must slumber still, the author says, and if Don Juan ever said goodbye to Miss Aurora Raby is not on record, since an order from the Most High and Mighty Catherine had made him prepone his departure. But the author doesn't declare it impossible either. To his ward Lila, Don Juan gives the choice to go with him or stay, and she decides to go with him. During their journey, Don Juan's mind, like always, is not concerned with the politics lying before him, but with the women surrounding him. He realizes his feelings towards his ward Lila have gained a much less fatherly shape, seeing what only now he had not seen, that she had grown a woman at 15. Also, there seems to have been a development of Don Juan's own character. During Lord Byron's 16 cantos, Don Juan has acted mostly as a passive lover. Unlike Don Juan, Juan is no seducer, but is seduced. Only with Miss Aurora Raby has he slowly started to take a more active part. Now, talking about the witchery of Juan's winning art seems also to implicate he's becoming more aware and assured of it. While he starts making plans involving his former ward, he remains completely oblivious of the political intrigue that might soon engulf him. He is unaware of the fact that Catherine might have heard about his amorous escapades and not like it. He remains unaware of any danger that might not be solved by a duel with Count Dumpkopf, whom he is presently looking forward to defeat. This is the moment Don Juan makes another acquaintance. This new acquaintance, in my opinion, makes this canto the most interesting one of the piece, because it is the first canto bringing out the author Henry Morford's nationality. It is an acquaintance Don Juan would hardly make, were it not for Morford's very own national pride. This man now tells Don Juan he need no longer worry about dueling Count Dumpkopf, because he has already beaten him to it. He introduces himself as Captain John Paul Jones. The historical John Paul Jones had Scottish origins, but he became an American national hero by taking part in the American Revolutionary War. A quite boring feature film from 1958 also credits him as a hero and founder of the American Navy. After the Revolutionary War, he joined the Imperial Navy of Catherine the Great's Russia. Now, he warns Don Juan not to return to the Russian court, based on the recent changes that he witnessed, and that his favor with the Empress might already have faded. Nothing much else happens, except the two heroes recognizing themselves to be worthy of each other, which is why Don Juan takes Captain Jones' warning to heart and does not return to Russia. On the accidental hearing of a song about lost love in the beautiful valleys of Vire or Vire, he decides to go to the south of France instead. Lila settles down with the family of the Sœurs de Chasserie, Morford doesn't really tell about his actual profession or function, just that he has been hunting buddies with the Marquis de Lafayette, another American national hero with French origins this time. Meanwhile, Don Juan settles down in pre-revolutionary Paris. Now, being fully aware and assured of the witchery of his winning art, he quickly becomes the hero of every party. It is a party of impending doom, though, for the fall of the monarchy has not yet happened, but is already close. Having already loved and left both common girls and ladies of high society, he decides to settle down with a certain Ella du Rosnel, a rich daughter of French nobility. Realizing how popular the noble Spaniard has become, the French revolutionary Louis-Antoine de Saint-Just, later dubbed the Archangel of the Terror, has decided to expose the Spaniard as an example of the corrupt nobility. To that end, he conspires with Marie, another common girl whom Don Juan has just recently loved and left. This is obviously Morford's most disappointing canto. For what Marie is about to do, she would most definitely not even have needed Saint-Just's help. Don Juan and Ella are listening to some sad and frankly boring sums of tragic love, with a sense of foreboding. About to enter the formally agreed rendezvous, he spots his former abandoned lover Marie passing by. When he opens the door, he finds Ella du Rosnel murdered. Albeit knowing very well who must have killed her, he leaves Paris and France as soon as possible, not only out of conviction that he would be blamed for her death, but also because he actually does feel responsible for it. He takes no farewell. Only Lila in the south of France receives a letter. It is a very melancholic letter. Don Juan greets his former ward, now as what he hopes her to be, a woman and a mother, and expresses the wish he might have been a little more like, well, whatever he believes her to be. But now he ponders the time to do that should be over. He also explicitly forbids her to search for him, because he does not wish to be found. The promise he once made to guard her, he considers the only one he actually kept, and to keep it in future, he considers it best to stay away from her. This letter, being both his first and last written farewell note, reminds him of the one he once received from Julia when he first left Spain. Now he returns, but not to the estate that he once left. Instead, he keeps roaming Spain, turning everywhere but home to Seville, while he receives the news that France's kingdom has been overthrown just like his personal one. Again, the author rushes forward a few years, allegedly because he has just a limited amount of paper left to get to the finish. At last, Don Juan returns to his estate in Seville, and with the help of the old housekeeper, takes possession of it. Keeping an open and generous house, stocked with excellent wine and 16 formidable cooks, along with his witty conversation, he becomes a popular figure of Seville very quickly. His many guests soon tell him that Donna Julia has been installed as the Lady Abbess of the convent, along with a lot more gossip about politics, astronomy, and ghosts. One of these ghost stories is more interesting than the others. On the great old cemetery of Seville, a new pedestal has appeared, with no inscription and no statue set upon it. No one knows whence it came. As Don Juan starts to swear, the clock strikes 12, and an unexpected visitor appears, with dark clothes and a wide-brimmed hat, like an opera villain, with spurs, a face of 50 years, and one large scar over the temple, which does not resemble any of the people the poem has until now introduced. But he whispers something in Don Juan's ear. Don Juan rises with an air of half pride, half anger, and leaves the party alongside his unexpected guest. 2 hours later, the guests start wondering why he isn't coming back. Only now they seem to remember how the lights went dim when the stranger entered, along with the smell of brimstone. However, the next day, upon the pedestal on the cemetery, a figure of Don Juan has appeared, dressed as he sat that night upon his chair. The evil spirit, when the heart is sold, may just as well step forward and take hold. That's the end. Is it a letdown? Absolutely. The stranger is obviously a variation of the legendary stone guest, known from most operas and stage plays based on the original Don Juan. It is also very short and vague, like a second-hand ending, but deliberately so. I find it disappointing, but strangely fitting. A second-hand ending for a second-hand hero. Lord Byron told in his very first stanzas that he had just borrowed his name from the stage. Despite Lord Byron's originality, the poem keeps borrowing and rearranging already existing things, motives and characters, both historical and fictional ones. Lambro is a variation of Byron's own Corsair. Miss Aurora Raby is a variation of Every Catholic Heroine by Walter Scott, and Lila a variation of Wilhelm Meister's Gypsy Ward Mignon by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Now, when Don Juan is finally returning back home, Henry Morford lets the character also turn back into his original legend. Still, something is off with that legend. First, whatever Don Juan has done, it does not merit the punishment suggested. Don Juan never was the Borador whom Tirso de Molina had described, nor was he the devious hypocrite who was sent to hell by Molière. Don Juan was a burlador solely in the perception of others, in the perception of Don Antonio, of Lambro, and in some continuation of Lord Henry. Likewise, his descent to hell is presented as a matter not of fact, but perception. Because they cannot explain his sudden disappearance, Don Juan's guests just assume that they have smelled brimstone on the stranger's arrival, and they assume he must have gone to hell based on that fake memory alone. Starting from that, they might now invent the whole story that he must have been the burlador of Seville before, based on his subsequent assumed descent to hell. But that doesn't actually make either true. For what we know, Don Juan might have staged his disappearance himself and placed a statue on the cemetery in order to escape his own legacy. 1952 stage play Don Juan, or The Love for Geometry by Swiss author Max Frisch, lets him do exactly that. And if his descent into hell is supposed to be real after all, why does the devil not come as an actual stone guest, but in what Henry Morford describes as the transparent disguise of an opera villain? The threats of heaven or hell have already turned into mere theatre thunder. Don Juan may be pissed he still has to abide by the rules of an old stage play that even his own guests no longer care to watch. But besides the theatre thunder of posterity, there is obviously very little for him to be afraid of. The evil spirit may just as well step forward and take hold. Well, Morford's ending lacks all of Lord Byron's skill, but its philosophy still seems to correspond just well enough to what I could make out of. Lord Byron's Manfred, Cain, or The Vision of Judgment. And in the end, perhaps the end was all I ever wanted. Now I can read the whole thing once again and hopefully start enjoying it on its own terms. Keep in the score. Fitzfalk 5, Aurora Raby 3, Lady Mandeville 4. So, 5 Don Juans have slept with the Duchess Fitzfalk. 3 Don Juans ended up in a relationship and or marriage with Aurora Raby. And 4 Don Juans had a romantic and or voluptuous encounter with Lady Adeline, aka Caroline Amundeville. We have a winner, and corresponding with Lord Byron's own 17th canto fragment, it is the Duchess of Fitzfalk. That wasn't surprising.